In this final lesson, we complete the Rails tutorial sample application by adding a social layer to our site, which allows users to follow and unfollow other users, resulting in each user's homepage displaying a status feed of the followed user's micropost. We start by learning how to model relationships between users, and then we build the corresponding web interface, including an introduction to Hotwire and Turbo. We end by developing a fully functional status feed, using both pure Ruby and a combination of Ruby and SQL.
In this lesson, we will complete the sample application by adding a social layer that allows users to follow and unfollow other users, resulting in each user's homepage displaying a status feed of the followed user's microposts. We'll start by learning how to model relationships between users, and then we'll build the corresponding web interface for following users and displaying the results. We'll end by developing a fully functional status feed, which involves some of the most challenging material in this tutorial, including a particularly tricky mix of Ruby and SQL. There are a lot of moving parts in this lesson, so I want to get started by giving a tour of the interface of what we're going to be developing. Let's take a look at some mock-ups of that. This is our goal for a user's profile. You can see that we've got a bunch of elements already implemented, including the gravatar image and name, the number of microposts, and this list here of the user's microposts, including the delete links and pagination. But we're going to add these links here, 50 following, 77 followers. If you want to find a user to follow, you're going to be able to go to /users, which is just the user index page. So a user like John Calvin will come into the All Users page, maybe click on Thomas Hobbes here, go to Hobbes's profile page. That'll have all of the same elements as Calvin's profile page, but in addition it'll have a follow link like this. So if Calvin clicks on follow, it will increment the number of followers that Hobbes has from 144 to 145, and we'll change that follow link to unfollow. After following Hobbes, Calvin can go to his home page, which includes a micropost feed, and those microposts now include the microposts of Hobbes. Of course, we've already implemented quite a few of these things, and we have partial implementations of a lot of it as well. But you can see once we're done, we'll have basically a minimalist Twitter clone. And getting to this point is the goal of this lesson. Underlying a lot of this new functionality will be relationships between users. Users like Calvin who are following Hobbes, and Hobbes who's being followed by Calvin. So our first step is to build a model to capture that relationship in code. Let's get started by checking out a branch. Now let's consider what we'd like our data model to look like. Let me open up a new Scratch window here, just to type in. So let's think about the relationships between these users. If Calvin follows Hobbes, that means Calvin is following Hobbes, and Hobbes is followed by Calvin. This suggests that Hobbes would have a collection of followers like this. We would expect Calvin to be among them. And meanwhile, Calvin, according to the usual pluralization conventions of Rails, would have followeds. That's because Calvin is following Hobbes, and Hobbes is followed by Calvin. But of course, linguistically, followeds is really strange. So we'll keep this followers convention, which sounds quite natural. But instead of writing followeds, we'll adopt Twitter's convention and write following. This is potentially confusing because in colloquial English usage, someone's following is actually the set of people following them. But of course, here we mean exactly the opposite. But I think at this point, because Twitter has popularized this usage, the meaning is clear enough. Let's start with this case of following. If you think about it, this means that Calvin has many users he's following, which suggests a has-many relationship. Let's review what we did in the last lesson in that context. So we can go here. This is what we did with user microposts. Remember that a user has many microposts, and as a result, there's this collection, user.microposts. So naively, you might think, well, we're going to have the same thing here. A user might have many users they're following. Here, each row in the following table has the follower ID, the followed ID, and then name, email address, and all the other information for the user. But if you think about this, it's incredibly redundant because all of the information here is already in the users table. And indeed, going the other way, doing something like hobs.followers would involve the same sort of redundancy. And finally, it's a maintenance nightmare because if a user changed their name, say here, user2 changed their name, we would have to update that name everywhere in every table. So what we'd really like is to maintain the current users table the way it is and have all this information be in only one place. This suggests that we're missing an underlying abstraction, and the way to figure it out is to think in terms of the REST architecture. Remember, the REST architecture involves resources that are created, updated, shown, destroyed, and so on. So what happens when one user follows another user? What's being created? Fundamentally, what's being created is a relationship between the two users. So in this section, what we're going to do is build a relationship model that captures that idea. Some websites have relationships between users that are symmetric. For example, Facebook, where users are friends, and if Calvin is friends with Hobbes, then Hobbes is also friends with Calvin. But these Twitter-style relationships are asymmetric. Absent some sort of blocking mechanism, Hobbes doesn't choose who follows him, but he does choose who he follows. So in this context, if Calvin is following Hobbes, but not vice versa, Calvin has an active relationship with Hobbes because he's actually taken action to do the follow, whereas Hobbes has a passive relationship with Calvin because he hasn't made any choice. The way we're going to model this is with what's called has-many-through. Let's take a look at that. This is modeling the idea of a user here named after me who's following a bunch of different users. So this is user.following over here with the IDs of the users. But this user.following collection is calculated through what's called a join table, in this case called active relationships, that has a list of all of the follower IDs and a list of all the followed IDs. So the way has-many-through works is for a particular user, it goes in and says, well, which of these active relationships have a follower ID equal to the current user's ID? And once it's made that list, it can then figure out what the user.following array should look like using has-many. Later on in this lesson, in order to construct user.followers, we'll have a corresponding passive relationships table. But if you think about it, that's going to be exactly the same information with just follower ID and followed ID reversed. As you might guess, Rails has a way of handling this. Indeed, what we're about to do is create a generic relationships table, and then we'll be able to switch between active relationships and passive relationships inside of the user model. So let's generate a model for those relationships. Take a look at a diagram here. We'll have the ID and the magic columns as usual, and then we'll have the follower ID and followed ID corresponding to these two columns here. Remember, it's singular though, Rails generate model relationship. Again, looking at our diagram, there are going to be two fields, a follower ID and a followed ID, each of which will be an integer. When we generated the micropost model, we used user ID references, and that automatically built part of the data model. But here, follower ID and followed ID both refer to users. So we're going to have to build the data model by hand. We're going to have to tell Rails in particular which class this corresponds to. Let's take a look at the migration. We're actually going to make a couple changes. So this is fine so far as it goes, but we're going to be finding by follower ID and followed ID, and in fact the combination of the two should be unique. Right? A user shouldn't be able to follow a user twice. And all of those requirements suggest a database index. As we saw in the micropost migration right here, we can add an index on a particular column just by writing index true, like this. And then we want a multiple key index on both of them, enforcing uniqueness. So that was this here, maybe? Yeah. So we want a combination of this add index, to users. No, this is actually to the relationships table, right? And we want it to be composite, so a combination of follower ID and followed ID. We saw this before, or was it right here? So we combined a bunch of different things from previous migrations to make this one. And so this line will arrange for an error to arise if, for any reason, we try to create a duplicate relationship. Let's save the file here and run the migration. Before implementing user following and followers, we first need to link users with relationships. Let's look at our diagram again. Here the relationship between the user and user.following is has many through active relationships. So that means that a user has many active relationships, and conversely, each of these relationships belongs to a user. Indeed, it belongs to a follower and to a followed user. So this record, for example, would belong to this user and would also belong to the followed user, in this case, over here. Let's take a look at the user model. And we also want to look at the newly generated relationship model. So here at the top, we've got has many microposts. So we're going to do this, has many. Now you might think we're going to do has many relationships, but remember we're modeling two different kinds of relationships, these active relationships and passive relationships. So we're starting with active. So we're going to do has many active relationships. But this won't work by default because this here, has many microposts, tells Rails to look for a class called micropost. And that does exist. There's a micropost model right here. But there's no active relationship model. Instead, there's a relationship model. So what we need to do is tell Rails the name of the class with an argument here. Class name relationship. In addition, over here with the micropost model, you might recall that there was a user ID to link the users to microposts. But now we have two different IDs. We have follower ID and followed ID. As I mentioned briefly in the last lesson, the user ID in the micropost table is called a foreign key. In this case, the foreign key will depend on whether we're talking about active relationships or passive relationships. Let's take a look at the diagram again. In order to make the user.following collection, we need this active relationships, and in this case, what identifies this user is in this column here, the follower ID column. So that's the foreign key in this context. That's the thing that links this user to this table. So here we need to tell Rails this is the class name relationship and foreign key follower ID. In this case here, we didn't have to tell Rails the name of the foreign key because by default it's just based on the user class. So a user model corresponds to a user ID. But in this case, follower does not correspond to a model, so we have to tell Rails explicitly. And finally, if the user is destroyed, any relationship should also be destroyed. So let's make this dependent destroy. Meanwhile, in the relationship model, we want the analog of this belongs to user. So we can do that here. We want belongs to follower. That tells us which user is the follower here, so it goes back through this association. But in micropost, when we said belongs to user, Rails knew by convention that that referred to the user model. Here, there is no follower model, so we have to tell Rails which class it is. And even though we won't need it right away, the symmetric case of followed is convenient to implement now. Just do this followed. Let's take a look at a table of some of the things this gives us. For any relationship, there's a follower and a followed right here. Corresponds to this. This would be the follower, and this would be followed. We can also create and build relationships through the association, as we did with microposts. Now there's a lot going on here, so don't worry if this is a little confusing right now. We'll be covering it in more detail when we build the web interface later in this lesson. Before moving on, let's add a couple simple validations to the relationship model. We can start with some tests. We've seen this before a couple times now. To create a new relationship, it needs a follower ID and a followed ID. We can just pick any IDs here because we're not actually going to save this relationship. Let's do our usual sanity check. And then check that both the follower ID and followed ID are required. So these will be presence validations. These should be red. And in fact, they're really red. If you look here, it says active record, record not unique. We saw this back in lesson 6 in the context of the user model. When we required email uniqueness at the database level, the user's fixtures broke the test because they're not unique by default. So the same thing had just happened here. And we'll use the same solution, which is just to make it empty for now. We'll fill this in later in this lesson. Save this again. It should be red for a different reason. The way I could tell, by the way, is not only that there were 3 of them, but they're errors. And what we want to do is get to failures. So these errors were exceptions being raised here. Active record not unique. Now we've got 2 failures corresponding to these here. So we just need to put 2 presence validations in here. Great. We can also double check to make sure our full test suite is green. Good, and now we're ready to start modeling following and followers. To set up user.following, which will return all of the followed users, we're going to use a has-many association. We saw this before with microposts, but in this case it's going to be has-many through the active relationships. It's right here. The syntax is similar to what we had before with has-many microposts, like this. Now naturally, in terms of the ID, which is followed ID here, we would get user.followeds, which as noted before is unnatural in English, so instead we're going to follow Twitter's convention and say user.following. So we'll say has-many following through active relationships. This has many we just made. Now, in the case of microposts, Rails knew to look for a foreign key called user ID because of the class user here. So that's what would happen here by default as well. But because it's called followed ID instead of user ID, as we saw here, we need to tell Rails what the source is. So the way to do that is source followed. One of the best ways to see the effect of this association is to write some tests. One of the great things about tests in this context is that they act as a client for the code. Because we're pretty far from having a web interface for this, and it's easy to get lost in all the abstraction. But the test code is nice and concrete, so let's take a look at it. Let's say test should follow and unfollow a user. So now what we want to do is write some tests that a user is not following another user, then have that user follow the second user, and then check to see that the following relationship has been established. In this context, it's convenient to introduce some utility methods, which of course we'll have to write. So let's define a couple of users. Let's call them Michael and Archer. Again, I'm just pulling these out of the user's fixtures. Just the first two here. And initially, let's say that Michael is not following Archer. So let's say assert not. And now I'm going to just make up a kind of utility method that I would like. Michael.following as a Boolean, so question mark, Archer. And then let's plan to write follow and unfollow utility methods to create and destroy these relationships. So Michael.follow Archer. And at this point, the user Michael should be following Archer. So assert this. And let's unfollow Archer. And now this should be true again, so we should assert not following. You can save that. It's going to complain here, of course, because these methods don't exist yet. Let's go to the user model. These are methods here, like following question mark and follow and unfollow are methods on the user instance here. So let's put it here in the user model. Start with a follow utility, so this follows a user. It's going to follow another user here, so let's say other user. And let's think about what this is going to be. So this is going to create an active relationship where the followed ID is this other user's ID. You can look back at our table. Remember, we can create a relationship through the association like this. So let's use that. The followed ID will be other user.id. The converse of that, we can just copy this actually. I'm going to do unfollow. This unfollows a user. And in this case, we're going to find by where the followed ID is the other user's ID. This will return the object, and then we'll call destroy on it. You might wonder, where's the follower ID in all this? And the answer is it's implicit, because we know which user these methods are being called on. And indeed, if you look up here, it's basically because of this association here. Because the foreign key is follower ID, that's the user's ID in this context. So looking at this diagram, the follower ID is always just the current user's ID. So finally, we can do this. It's our following question mark Boolean. And now we could find the relationship and see if it exists, but there's an even nicer way to do it. Actually, let's do it that way. Let's do it that way first, and then we can refactor it. Active relationships.find by followed ID is the other user .id. So if this exists, if this is not nil, then following question mark is true. So we can say bang.nil question mark. So this is nil if the user isn't following the other user, and then we negate it here with the bang. So let's save that. We might even be green. Nope. Oh, wrong number of arguments here. Right, because the following question mark method needs to take an other user. So let's just do that. That's pretty obvious. Now we are green. Great. I just mentioned, though, that there's a more elegant way to do this here. Because of this association up here has many following, there's a user.following. Remember, that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to get this user.following. So inside the object itself, inside this model, we can do self.following. That's that collection of users that this user is following. We can treat this like an array. In particular, we can call the include question mark method on it and see if this other user is in that list. You can see we're still green. And of course, as usual, unless we're doing an assignment like down here, we can omit this self dot. I included it here just because we have user.following here. So that's the structure. This is user.following, but inside the model, we can just do following. And that's it. We can now create a following relationship using this follow method and destroy that relationship using unfollow. So this is a working backend now for the user following and unfollowing. All right, there was a text box there indicating that there's a better way to make these follow and unfollow methods. So let me show you how to do that. This is thanks to a reader who wrote in. It's really quite obvious. Actually, I'm disappointed in myself that I didn't see this before. But we can treat this following object through the association as an array. Remember down here we do following.include question mark. This treats it as if it were an array. So we can use the shovel operator. It's the same as the push method we saw back in lesson 4. And we can say following shovel operator other user. You can save it here and run the tests. You can see it's still working. And down here in unfollow, we can do this. We can do following dot delete, and then just the object we want to delete, the element in the array. Again, it's not technically an array, but we can treat it like that. It's one of the cool things about Ruby and Rails. You can see our test suite is still green, which is an indication that these are working. So this is a much cleaner way of following and unfollowing users. Rather than talking about the active relationships specifically, we can go through the association and use these array methods. Much more natural. Of course, we'd like to be able to go the other way, which is to have, in addition to this user.following, also have user.followers. In other words, we want to be able to have a passive relationships join table that will say has many through user.followers. So we can do that here. This is just the reverse. Using this data model, you can see it's the same as active relationships here in the join table, just with followed ID and follower ID reversed, like this. Oops, we can do these two here. So here what Rails will do is look for the followed ID here in this column, which we can then match up with the follower ID in the second column. And from that, we can infer the collection user.followers to return a list of all the users that are following the given user. The implementation is almost exactly the same, just reversing some things. So we can do, actually just copy both of these here, just copy say has many passive relationships. Again, we need a class name relationship because there is no passive relationship model. Instead of the follower ID being the foreign key, it's now the followed ID. And then we have has many following through passive relationships, source follower. Let's take a look at the failing test there. Line 81, that's this here. That's weird. Why did that fail? Oh, it's because we didn't change has many following to has many followers. So our test actually caught something that broke. That's good. Okay, we're back to green. And so if we believe this parallel structure actually worked, which we might if we look at this diagram, has many followers through passive relationships, this should work. So an easy way to test that is to go in here, and in addition to saying assert Michael.following question mark Archer, we can borrow from this here, this following, and say that Archer's followers should include Michael. Save that and see if we're still green. Alright, so now we've got a test for the passive relationships as well as for the active relationships. By the way, at this point, you could actually implement something like a followed by question mark method to complement this method. It turns out we won't actually need that in the implementation, but it wouldn't be a terrible idea. So believe it or not, this completes the data modeling. Let's take a look at our test suite, make sure it's green. Okay, this test here, it's not very long, but it really tests a lot of this data modeling here. Pretty much anything changed here will break something, so we could do this. Follower IDs will break. If we change this to a relationship, it breaks. So this is a really nice sensitive test of these has many through associations. This is quite abstract though, so I think it'll become a lot clearer once we build the web interface that lets users follow each other. To get a sense of where we're going with the web interface for following users, let's take another look at the mockups from the beginning of the lesson. So here's a profile page, a page for all users, and then this is another user. So if John Calvin is logged in and visit Thomas Hobbes's profile page, he should see this follow link, unless he's already following Hobbes, in which case he should see an unfollow link. So this is the first part of the interface we want to build, including this form here and also this little area that has the statistics. To get started with that, as usual, it's always nice to have some sample data when making an interface. So let's open up our seeds.rb. This is getting long enough that I'm going to put in some comments indicating what each section does. This is for users. This here is for microposts. And now we're going to add some code for creating following relationships. The exact details here are somewhat arbitrary, but what we're going to do is just create enough following relationships to create the interface. So let's start by selecting all the users in the database. And let's pick out the first one. And let's say the followed users will be with index 2 up to 50. So user 0, which is this one here, the one we just picked out, will end up following users with index 2 up to 50. And that user's followers, we'll say, are users 3 up to 40. So now for each of these users to be followed, we want to call user.follow. And likewise for the followers. Each follower should follow the user. Then we reset the database and seed it as usual. I've shortened the sequence there, but don't be alarmed. That can take quite a bit of time to create the sample data, especially all these following relationships. At this point, we're ready to make that stats area. Let's take a look at this. This is this area here. I've got a close-up here. So we're going to make this, and we're going to make the follow form right here. Because we plan to put those stats on both the profile page and the home page, we should put them in a partial. Should be in the shared directory. Let's go here. App views shared. Let's call it stats. Let's put it in a div with class stats. And now let's take a look at the mockup again. So this should be a link to the following, and this should be a link to the followers. We don't actually have those routes defined yet, so let's stub it out for now. And then inside this link, let's have the count, like this, and then a label. So to put it in the strong tag with class following, actually ID following, and class stat. I actually don't know if this is going to work. Let's check it out. No, it didn't. So we can do this, and then class stat, and this should be the following count. So remember, we have this, say a current user dot following. Of course, this will only work for logged in users and will only really apply to the home page and the user's own profile page. So we'll fix this up in just a moment, but let's start off with this. Current user dot following dot count. As with counting the microposts through the association, this is smart. Rails calculates this in the database and then returns the result. So it's very efficient. And we can say following. And then have the same sort of thing for the followers. So let's call this the followers ID. Also a stat class, and this should be followers. Let's render this on the home page to start off with. It's going to be after the user info, but before the micropost form. So let's do this section. Class stats. And we can render. Shared stats. And let's check it out. So we have to log in. Let's go to the home page. And there it is. It's not styled yet, but it's shown up. That's pretty cool. Let's put the CSS in. This is going to go in the sidebar CSS, which is right here. So let's just add it to the bottom of that, right before this forms part. And as I often have, I'm just going to copy this from the tutorial. copy into the sidebars area. It starts with this stats down to users.follow. Paste that in. Oops, I guess I missed that closing brace, didn't I? Yep. Okay. Let's take a look at this, refresh it. Nice. If I mouse over it, yeah, it changes color. That's great. Now let's put the stats on the user profile page. That's show. Same thing, we can render stats partial right here after the name. So this after this section. So let's go to the profile. And there it is again. But of course this only works for this user. If we go to a different user, it's the stats for the current user. That's not what we want at all though. So if we go here, what we want is to use the current user only if there's not already an @user. So remember, in the user's controller, there's this @user equals user.find params of ID. So that comes out of here, this 5 here in the URL. But this page is currently using the current user that's logged in rather than user 5. So we want to use @user if it exists, otherwise use current user. So let's define @user. This is embedded Ruby, but we're not actually inserting this into the template, so we don't need an equal sign here. So this is going to be, the user is going to be, well, let's use @user if it exists, but if that isn't defined, then it'll be nil, and we can say or current user. This may look familiar. We saw this in the sessions helper. This here, @current user or equals user.findBy, is exactly the same kind of construction we have here. So this can be replaced with or equals current user, like that. And then instead of current user, we can say @user. Save that, and now it should change right here. There it is, one following, one followers. By the way, it's okay to have plural followers here, even though there's only one, because this is a label. Instead of saying one followers, this is saying followers 1. So that's why we didn't use the pluralized method in this case. Now that the stats are basically working, let's fill in these links here, these hrefs, to the following user path and the followers user path. As you might guess, that involves editing the routes file. So what we'd like to do here is put in some embedded Ruby and say following user path of @user. And this should return something like /user/1/following. So this is going to be the page for the users being followed. Again, we can look at the mockup here. That's over here. Here it should be, here's following. Yeah. So we want to link to this page, which means creating a route that has the user's ID in it. So we want it to be something like this. /users, let's go here. /user/1/following. Compare this to /user/1/edit. Right. So we want this to be following, and this will return the users that user 1 is following. And the way to do that is using what's called the member method. It works like this. Give a block to resources users, and then we can say member do, responding to GET requests, get following and followers. This is the kind of thing you can just read about if you go to Google and type something like Rails routing, or look at the footnote in the Rails tutorial. You'll see that this is how to make a URL of this form. Or rather, it's how to make a route that gives you that kind of URL. By the way, if you wanted something that didn't have the ID, if you just wanted /user/tigers, something like that, you would define it like this with collection. But we don't need that because there are no tigers here. Well, except in the mockups. So this gives us this following user path, and it also gives us followers user path. We can paste that in here. And of course, we're going to have to define actions and views for these, but this will give us the route. Save that and take a look. Actually, save this here. Refresh it and see if we mouse over, what do we get? You can see here in the bottom left, /user/1/following, so it worked. If we go back to that other user, or another user, here's this one here, we've now got this stat partial working. All we need to complete our mockup is to put a follow form or an unfollow form. These forms will be creating and destroying relationships, but they're going to be accessed through the user's resource here, this user's controller. So it's convenient to define the forms themselves in the user's view directory. So that's an app views users. And we'll define them as partials and then render them on the user show page. So let's make a follow form here. Again, the leading underscore because it's a partial. And take a look at this. Actually, let's make the unfollow form too while we're at it. Now this is a little tricky. This is a form for creating a new relationship. So that means we need, in this follow form, a new active relationship object in memory. Remember from our table, we can get that using build here. So in this case, it's the current user. I'm going to do this. Form for current user dot active relationships dot build, and the followed ID will be the user on this page, so that's that user's ID. So this is absolutely the kind of thing you might very well not have figured out. It might take some experimentation to get it working. In fact, there's a mistake here. There we go. But you can work an analogy with things like the sign-up form. Here we have form for @user, and this @user is from the user's controller. It's right here. So this is the equivalent of saying current user.activerelationships.new, except in this case it's build, and then we have to give it the followed ID in order to make the association. And then an analogy with this here, there's going to be a form variable, do f. Let's take a look at the mockup. So there's just a submit button. There's no other text. Go here. We can say f.submit follow, and then give it the classes that we use to style it. And these are from Bootstrap. So now think about what this is going to do in terms of the routing. This form for a new user is routed via the routes here to the user's resource. In particular, it gets routed because of resources users to the create action here because it's a post request. So this here is going to issue a post request not to the user's controller, but because this is a relationship, to the relationships controller. That controller doesn't exist yet. We're about to create it, but we can make the route right now. We can add the resource for relationships right here. And we're only going to be creating and destroying them. But I also noticed that there's some cruft here, some extra stuff that came from generating things. We don't need any of those. Let's save that. And this will now give us the route that will respond to this request. This will be clearer once we render this on a page. In fact, let's see how that works. Let's make a follow form for users. So this is going to be either the follow form or the unfollow form, depending on whether the user is following the other user. So if, we'll use our following question mark helper, if the current user is following the user whose profile this is, so that's @user, that's if this is true, then we should render the unfollow form. This is render unfollow, else render the follow form. And then we can go to the show page, and inside here, let's render it right above the microposts. So render follow form. Save this and save this, and let's find a user that's not being followed. So actually this user isn't being followed, so it should work. There we go, there's the follow form at the top. And you can see that the action is /relationships, and that route here that we just made, that'll be routed to the create action in the relationships controller, which we'll generate in a moment. Let's take a look at our tests. You can see we've got an error here. Undefined method following question mark for nil class. So where is that coming from? It's coming from here. So this nil class means that current user is nil. And that's true. If we look here in the follow form, there has to be a current user. But of course, this doesn't exist if the user isn't logged in. So we should only render this follow form if the user is logged in. Go here, if logged in. You can see our tests are useful, even though we haven't actually specifically tested that. It still caught something. It's good. There's something else weird going on. If we look at this follow form, think about what's happening if we submit this. In the create action for the relationship, we're going to have to find the followed user, just like we did here in the create action. There's going to be strong parameters. Here it was name, email, password, password confirmation. We're going to have something similar in the relationships controller, but right now there's no way to transmit that information from the form. This object knows the followed ID, but there's no way that that can propagate all the way to the controller. So what we have to do is the same thing that we did in lesson 10, where we had an email on the password resets form. So let's see where that was. That was here. We needed a hidden tag. So we can do the same thing here. Let's put it in a div. Say div hidden field tag. Followed ID, and just @user ID. And you know what I've realized is we don't actually need this. We do not need the followed ID here. We actually don't need that ID just to create this thing in memory. We never actually use that information when making the form. Okay, so now this is the exact analog of doing this here. User.new. Now it's current user.activerelationships.build. So remember, build is basically the same as new. Then we've got this hidden field that will propagate the user to be followed and then we can pull it out with params of followed ID. Let's make the unfollow form now. Just copy this. It's going to be quite similar. Now what we're going to do is find the relationship between these users using current user.activeRelationships.findBy at user.id. Oh, and that's the followed ID. And then this is to destroy the relationship, so we need to tell it its method delete. The way to do that is like this. It's part of the HTML, so we need to give it HTML as the key, and then the value is the hash method delete. You've seen that before. It's right here in the micropost form. So here we've got HTML multipart true, and now we're doing HTML method delete. So we've also seen method delete a couple times. Right, so we've got this link to here, for example. And in this case, we don't need the followed ID in the hidden field, because this here, this form, this is for a relationship that already exists. But I think we need to know closing paren here. Yeah. So when we submit this form, it will go to the destroy action of the relationships controller, and this here will give us the ID of the relationship, which we can then find in the database and destroy. So we don't need this here. This should be unfollow. And let's take a look at it. There's one more change we're going to make. Let's look at a user that's being followed. I think user 5 was being followed. Yeah. Well, for one, I should change this from unfollow to unfollow. But here you can see that the color is the same. And it's actually nice. We can just get rid of this button primary. I'll make it gray instead of blue. There we go. So if we look at this form, you can see there's a form for editing a relationship, and the reason that Rails knows to do that is because this relationship already exists. We saw this back with this edit form for users. Here's the method is delete. That's from this here. And it has the ID, action equals /relationship /3. So this is the ID that identifies the relationship between the current user that's logged in and user 5. This will become clearer in a couple sections when we actually get these forms working. But for now, the front end is working. We've got these stats here on the home page, the profile page, on the users page. There's just one more thing. You might have noticed it actually just now. On the user's own profile page, there's no reason to have this follow button, so we should add something in there. In the follow form, we can say unless current user !@user. So what happened here is the current user is the same as user 1. This is what gives rise to @user. This is in here. User.find of params of ID, which is 1 in this case, but that's also current user, so we should say unless current user !@user using our current user boolean, then render the follow form. Save that, and there we go. So this is a pretty typical sequence. We've made some sample data, we've built the front end, and now we need to make the back end, so that means getting the following and followers pages to work and getting these forms to work, these follow and unfollow forms. Let's start with the following and followers pages. You can take a look at the mockups for those. So that's this here and this here, you can see they're really similar, and in fact will define an underlying view for both of them. It won't actually be a partial though, as we'll see. But first we'll do a little access control. You certainly need to be logged in to see these pages. So let's write some tests. User controller test. Users controller, I should say. So we can do this and say get following with the ID @user, and then we should be redirected to the root URL. Just copy this here. Actually, that's not true. We should be redirected to the login URL, right? And then same thing for followers. Oops, I doubled that up, didn't I? Followers, when not logged in. Followers. It should be red. There are actually errors here because the followers and following actions don't exist. We're going to need this though, we might as well put them in. So let's go to the users controller. Here they are. We're going to put these right at the end. Now we're missing the template. We are going to define that template in a moment, but all we need to do to get these tests to pass is to add following and followers to the list of actions protected by the logged in user before filter. So we can do this. Now we should be green. All right. Now because these two pages are almost identical, we're actually going to make a non-partial for them and then render that template. So it's going to be called show follow. It's going to be the same thing here. And that template will take in a title. We'll say @title, in this case, is following. Down here will be followers. And here we'll have a user from the params. It's actually going to be the same user in here. You could put this in a before filter. Doesn't really seem like it's worth the effort here. And then there are going to be a bunch of users here on the side, right here. So this is going to be on the following page. These are going to be the users that are being followed, and here it'll be the followers. So let's put those in instance variables called @users. It's going to be @user.following. And you can see we've got pagination links here, so we're going to paginate these. As usual, this will just magically work. We've got this complicated association, but the pagination will work through the association automatically. This is the same thing, except instead of following, it's followers. And these are all the variables we need, and we just need to make the template. Let's do that here. Oops, I need to give it the extension. The title will be given by this @title. So we can just do this here. As usual, it's provide title and then @title. And then there's just a bunch of structure, so I'll type it in pretty quickly. It's not that important, the details here. Got the user info. If you want, you can actually define some partials for these. At this stage, it's probably not that important, though. Surprisingly hard to get the exact partials you might want. If there are any users, we're going to render these here aside. I'm going to link to each user. We're going to make them small, these gravitars. It's just going to be the gravatar. That's what these represent here. These little images on the side. So let's do link to gravatar for user size 30. And a link to the user path of user. Let's see what that looks like. Save this, save this. And we can go to here. Let's look at give us the stats partial. All right, syntax error. It's good to look at this early on. We're missing an end somewhere. Oh, it's the if at users.any right here. That's after the div. We want to do this here. I usually put the end in right away, and this is why. All right, that's looking good. So this is pretty close to this mockup right here. All we need is the stuff in the middle here. So let's do that. I learned my lesson there. And here we're reusing the underscore user partial. Remember, we did render at users before. This iterates through the collection automatically because each of these is a class user. Rails looks for an underscore user partial. And so this should just work. Let's take a look. All right. Only one thing left, which is pagination. Do that. And because these are users and we're in the user's controller, we can just do will paginate without any argument. All right, it's working. You can see /1/following page 2. And of course, we can look at the followers as well. Oops, it's the same URL though. Look at that. That's a bug. Let's fix that. That's in the stats partial. So over here, you probably noticed that, but I missed it. This should be followers user path. Ah, there we go. /user/1/followers. And of course, all of these are linked too. You can click on one of those. I almost clicked on this. It doesn't work yet, though. Following and followers are both working. Great. And you can see the delete links here, and that's because I'm an admin, or I'm logged in as an admin. It looks like there's some space that should be put in here. Micropost 50. Let's put that in. Yeah, I just need a space. Great. Check the profile link. Hope that's not working either. Did I just forget that? Yeah, I did. There it is. It can either be current user or @user. It actually doesn't matter. But we set it up here, right? This is always... Actually, no, it does matter, because we can look at the profiles of other people. We can look at the followers of other people. So we could go here, click on this. Right, so we definitely want it to be @user and not current user. So view my profile. This is now not my profile, the logged in user, but rather the profile of this particular user. There's one more thing, which is that this here, the space here is not quite right. So let's fix that. And I figured this out. It's actually an error in the book, which has now been fixed. It's in the CSS here, or that's the hint. It gives us the hint of what's going on. There's a rule here, .users.follow. So this is for something that has class users, which we get on things like this. Right? This has class users, this list. But there's this extra padding on the left here. So for something of class follow as well, we have padding 0. The problem is that on the show follow template, we just have class equals users. So it should be class users and follow. So if we do this, go back here, this should now work. Right. Now that we've got this working, let's write a couple of short tests to verify the behavior. We'll generate an integration test for following. This will be called following test. Let's take a look at it. There it is, and let's do a little setup. What I want is an @user as usual. And let's log in as that user. And then let's test the following page and the followers page. In fact, they'll be really similar. We can probably just copy this one. So let's get following user path of @user. And let's verify that the following count appears on the page and that links to all of the users being followed appear as well. So remember what we've been doing with something like a count. Instead of specifying the HTML tag using assert select, we've been doing assert match. That count.toS to make a string, and then that should be somewhere on the body. Again, response.body is the whole HTML, although in this case it actually is inside the body tag. And then for each of the users being followed, so @user.following.each, assert select, should be an anchor tag with href equal to the users of the user path of user. Remember, inside the test in this context, we can't actually just use user by itself. Let's save that and see what happens. So if we get rid of this here, see that it doesn't quite work. Oh, it did work. So I don't think it does work in general. In fact, in order to avoid a spurious passing like this, we should probably do something like this. So what happened here is we haven't set up the fixtures to have user following. Yeah, so there's a failure here. I'm going to leave this in because I think it's going to fail once we set up the associations. So let's set up the fixtures to actually make these tests do something useful. Remember with the microposts, we saw that we could build the association like this. So here's a micropost with the key orange, and we can just say user Michael like that. We're going to do the same thing inside the relationships YAML file. We don't really care what the names of these things are, so let's just call them 1 through 4. So 1 will be an association between Michael, who will be the follower. Michael will be following Lana. So followed is Lana. And let's do second one. Let's say Michael will follow Mallory. Just review who these are. So here's Lana and Mallory. So 2 will be, just copy this. I think I did copy it actually. Yeah. Followed will be Mallory. And then 3, let's say that Lana is following Michael. Let me just do this here. And say that Archer is also following Michael. Save this, and now go back to the test. Here it is. Right, so now instead of having a failure, we have an error, and that's because of this thing here that I mentioned before. This should be user path of user. Doesn't work in the test, but now we should be green. All right. Let's test the followers page in the same way. We can just copy this thing or cut it. That'll work. Just paste twice. And now we want to get followers user path. Assert that this is not empty. Assert that the followers count appears. And then at user.followers. Oops. Ah, right. I have test following page. It should be test followers page. All right, now we're green. Rerun the full test suite. Great, so now we're done with the following and followers pages. At this point, we're ready to get that follow button to work. This is right here. If we go to, say, this profile page. So here's the unfollow button, and similarly, we've got like a follow button here. Yeah, so we want to get these to work. You certainly have to be logged in to use these, so let's put some access control on the relationships controller. Of course, that involves first generating it, so let's do that. Oops. And we can open up the test. And as is often the case with our create and destroy protection, we're going to assert that there's no difference in a particular count, in this case the relationship count, and also assert that we're redirected to the login URL. So test create should require logged in user. Where did we do this before? We've been doing test should redirect the thing, so I'm going to do that. I'm going to say test should redirect create when not logged in. Doesn't really matter, but it's nice to be consistent here. And we can see here our assert no difference. Assert no difference in relationship count. We'll post to create. And the same thing for destroy. Oh, I forgot the redirect that, didn't I? So redirected to root URL, or no, login URL. So this is delete destroy, and it needs an ID to make the route properly. It doesn't matter which ID because we're not actually going to be destroying anything, but it needs to be a real ID to get the route to work. So let's pull something out of the fixtures. Relationships of 1 will work. Save that and see if we're green. Nope, there's something wrong here. What are we doing here? Oh yeah, did the same thing here. Should redirect destroy. 2 errors. Right. This is good. It should be red. We don't have any access control on this controller yet, so let's do the same thing we did before. We can add or not add these actions actually, but I like to add them now. Create and destroy. Save it. It should go from errors to a different kind of error. So it was before an error because the controllers or the actions weren't there. Now it's because the templates aren't there. So at this point we can put in this filter. Before action, logged in user, only create and destroy. Of course, there are only 2 actions here, so we could just leave this blank. In fact, I'm going to do that. We don't need to specify it. These are the only actions we're going to have, so we can just protect the whole thing. There we go, and now we're correctly redirecting to the login URL. And now let's check to see if these are working. I'm going to put in a debugger in the create action. So this is if you follow a user. All right, so let's go over here, and this is going to create a new relationship, so that should have stopped it. In the debugger, there it is. Let's look at params. You can see params of followed ID. That's what's going to give us the user to follow. So this is working. That means our little form here, this follow form, actually gave us the right kind of form to create a new user. And I was right, we could get rid of that ID stuff. We just need current user.activeRelationships.build to create a new relationship object. And then this hidden field is what created this params of followed ID. So we can do this. Right. So we can fill this out now. Just do this. So what is involved in creating this relationship? Well, we need to pull out the user. And then we want the current user to follow that user. And we're guaranteed to have a current user because of this before action here, the before filter. So current user.follow user, and then redirect back to the same profile. Redirect to user. Do Control D to release the debugger here. See what happens. That worked. Look at that. The followers incremented. And now this user should be one of the followed users, right? Following here. There it is. Macy Gleason is on the list. Of course, unfollow doesn't work. Let's get that working. Put the debugger in again. So now, params of ID, it's right here. Let's look that up. It's a relationship. And there it is. This is the relationship between follower ID 1 and followed ID 2. Recall from the diagram. These are the two columns, so this is follower ID 1, followed ID 2. In fact, it's exactly what we have here. It's great. So all we need to do is destroy that relationship. There are actually two ways to do it. Let's go here, get rid of the debugger. Save this. So in here we want to do, well, there are a couple things we could do. We could actually find that relationship like this. This is one way to do it. We could do this, and then we could destroy it, and then redirect to relationship dot followed. I think this will work. Let's take a look. Yeah, that worked. But it's not symmetric with the create action. I like the idea of unfollowing the user. Remember, we have an unfollow helper, or unfollow method on the user model. So instead of doing this, we can do this. I think this is just slightly clearer. We can invoke the followed here, dot followed, and then say current user dot unfollow. We need to bind this to a user, so user equals that, and then redirect to user. Same thing, so if you click this twice, to just toggle. And there it is, it's working.
We've made some good progress here. We now have a working follow button using regular HTML forms. Just take a look at where we are. So here, if we have 0 followers and then click on follow, this is a label, so the pluralization is okay. It's 1, so this is the number of followers, 1. I'm a stickler for getting that pluralization right, so I think of these as labels though. Following, followers. How many followers? 1. Unfollow, back to 0. So this works perfectly well, but if you think about it, hardly anything is changing on this page. It's just the button going from follow to unfollow and this little count here. If you look at our code, what's going on is we're submitting the form here, follow or unfollow, and then that's going into the controller that actually does the follow or unfollow, and then it redirects. So we have to hit the server and then have a whole extra web request and reload the whole page. But because only a little bit of the page is actually changing, it would be really convenient if we could change just the parts of the page that actually need to be modified. In this section, we're going to learn how to do that using something called Hotwire. Hotwire is actually a separate JavaScript framework, but it was developed in the context of Rails applications, so it works incredibly well with Rails. And it allows us to do exactly what I was just describing, change just the parts of the pages that we need to modify and leaving everything else alone. The result is that we get all of the advantages of having a nice unified web framework like Rails with a speed that rivals so-called single-page apps, which use JavaScript to render things like this in the browser. That can work, but it's also a lot more complex. This is much simpler while still being highly performant. All right, let's take a look at how to do that. We'll actually handle both the regular and hotwire ways of doing things at the same time. Among other things, that allows the site to degrade gracefully, as they say, so that if someone has JavaScript turned off, we can still use the regular forms. The specific part of Hotwire we'll be using, which is really the heart of Hotwire, is called Turbo. And we want our controller to be able to handle both HTML submissions and so-called turbo streams. And the way we'll do that is with a special method called respond_to. So let's put that in here. So respond_to takes a block variable. We'll call it format, although it can be anything, but format's the standard name. And the way this works is it kind of looks like there are multiple lines that would all be executed, but it's really more like an if-else statement. So we're going to say format.html, and this is really if the format is HTML, we're going to do this here. We're going to redirect to user. And if the format is TurboStream, well, we're just going to do nothing, actually. It turns out there's a default behavior that we'll be able to make use of. All right, let's do the same thing down here. Now, the default behavior of format.turbostream is to look for a file called create.turbostream.erb. And likewise for destroy.turbostream.erb. In this case, in the views directory for relationships. So that's where we're going to put the file to replace just those little pieces of HTML. This here, the button, and this here, the followers. All right, so let's create those. It'll make it clearer exactly how this works. So it's going to be an app views relationships, and we'll call it create.turbostream.erb. Again, this is a good example of Rails convention over configuration. As long as it's called create.turbostream.erb, Rails knows to look for it in the create action. Let's do destroy as well. Now Turbo supplies us with a TurboStream object that has an update method. And we're going to call that update method and give it the HTML that it should then insert onto the page. Let's put it over here. And actually, let's look over at this here. All right, so what we're going to do is we're going to replace the HTML here. This is the follow form. So it's identified by an ID here. And then we're also going to replace that statistic we're going to replace the HTML inside of this here, ID equals followers. So let's take a look at how that works. So we're going to update, and this takes an argument equal to the ID of the thing we want to replace. So here it's going to be follow form. This is embedded Ruby, so we're using the percent and then here percent equals because we're actually going to insert it. And here we can just put in the HTML we want. If someone creates a following relationship, then we should show the unfollow form. Now we could just type that out, but we already have an unfollow form. It's over here. So we can just render it as a partial. Note that we have to put users here before unfollow, because this is in the relationships views directory. We have to tell Rails where the unfollow partial is located. And then we want to update the followers here as well in the stats. And here we can just render the user followers count like this. Which is the same thing as over here. Now think about what the destroy should do. Well, with destroy, we want to do the same thing here. We just want to render the number of followers. So this should be the same. The only difference is that instead of rendering the unfollow form, if we destroy a following relationship, that means we have unfollowed and we want the follow form. So we can just copy this. And here, just say follow. So let's take a look at this. Refresh it. Oops. Well, we know that Turbo is doing something. Aha. I forgot this here. Do. So we know it's actually calling the template. That's actually a tricky thing to prove. Oh, we've got another thing. Ah, yes, this is excellent. So here we go. Note what's going on here. Why is this not working? If you follow the text, it actually mentions this, but it's nice in the screencast to see it not work like this, which gives us a chance to figure out what's wrong. So see if you can figure out what's wrong. If you look here, we're calling @user. We have an @user over here in the stats, but this is being called from a different action. But here, this is the create and destroy action. We actually don't have an @user. So here, we need to change it to @user. Ah, yes, and so here we go. Tests would catch these things, by the way, and that's actually the next section, is to write tests for this. Okay, here we go. One more time. Ah, right here. Oh, and this here. Here we go. So this changed to 1, to the followers is 1. There we go. So that's working. Now, wait a minute. Why is this working now that we've fixed those things that were wrong? How does Rails know to use Turbo? Well, the answer is that Turbo is automatically enabled by default. Once Turbo is installed, which we did back in lesson 8, we can automatically use it. And it's also nice sometimes to go into here and say, like, something like this. It's hard to tell with this local server, I mean local running in the Cloud IDE here, but it's hard to tell. Everything is fast. So you can see here we've got still Turbo. Oops, why is that not showing? Oh, I didn't save this here. So still Turbo, from Turbo, still Turbo. So this is a way of proving that Turbo is actually working, because it looks pretty much the same if you get rid of this here. And then here, we can just comment this out. If we comment this out, Rails knows that, well, if there's not something to handle a turbo stream, then it will go back to the regular HTML. So that's still pretty fast. In fact, let's go here, just verify. So you can see it's not saying from Turbo. So this is now regular HTML. It is still a little snappier, even with this small application. And of course, as an application gets more complex, the advantages of Turbo become bigger and bigger. So this is just a little taste of it. Hotwire is actually a pretty big subject, but just getting started with it is often the hardest thing. So with this little refinement, you've now taken an important first step toward learning how to use Hotwire in general. As we saw though, it can be quite error prone. So to guard against regressions, let's write some tests. In this section, we'll add some tests for following and unfollowing users, both for regular HTML form submissions and for Turbo. To get started with this, let's define another user. We're going to be following and unfollowing, so we need something other than just @user. Let's just say @other. Pull out one of the other fixture users. I like to put that space in just to line everything up. And let's go to the bottom of the file and make a new section for the follow test and for then unfollowing. So let's do the follow test first. Can inherit from this here, following. That'll give us our setup. And let's test the standard way first. So it's just the regular HTML form way. So how might we do this? Well, we want to post to the relationships path. That will give us the create action. And what we need is the params to have the followed ID. So that's this. And that's going to be @other.id. So what should happen when we do this post? Well, what should happen is the following count of the user should be incremented by 1. So we can do that with assert difference. And this takes a string that defines the object, in this case @user, .following.count, change by 1, then we give it this in the block, and that should work. So let's run our test suite. You could do Rails test, of course, but I like using guard. So let's just save this again. It should just run that one test. All right, so it's passing. It's also nice sometimes just to do this, just comment it out. Right, that's nice. The unfollow test is almost exactly the same. Let's copy and paste, and then we'll modify it. So the unfollow test should increment by -1, which is to say to go down by 1. And instead of posting to the relationships path, we need to issue a delete request to get to destroy. And instead of the relationships path, it's actually the relationship path for the known relationship, which in this case, well, what is it? We don't have one. So let's just call it @relationship. So if we delete to the relationship path of the relationship between these two users, it should lower the following count by 1. But that this doesn't exist tells us we need another setup method. This is why it's nice to break this into pieces. So let's do class unfollow. And we want the other setup method. We want the following setup method to get the @user @other and log in the user. So unfollow inherits from following. So to get that, we want setup. To execute the superclass's setup method, we call super. And then we need to define the relationship. But because we're destroying a relationship, we actually need to make sure that the user is following the other user. So we can do that like this. And then we can find the relationship in the database by using find by through @user.activeRelationships. It's here. It's right here. And here we want the followed ID to be the other user's ID. Okay, so that gives us the @relationship variable, and let's save it and see what happens. Yeah, that was a lot of stuff. It's not surprising it didn't work. Everything has to be exactly right to get it to work. The problem is we're inheriting from following here. We actually want to inherit from unfollow. We didn't even get that setup method. There we go. Great. Now it's green. And this is pretty much it. We've now tested the regular way of doing things. All we need to do now is test the hotwire way. And it's really simple. All we need to do is tell Rails to use the format TurboStream, so that instead of calling these lines here, it'll invoke these lines. The way to do that in a test is to add the format right here. So that's TurboStream as a symbol. All right, let's see if that works. Okay. Let's do this here. Oh, and I should change this to unfollow, shouldn't I? All right, so there's just a couple more things I want to do before leaving this. We haven't tested these redirects here, and it's especially nice to test the status here just to make sure we don't have any regressions. It's really easy to leave this off. So let's do this here. Could be a little confusing here because this is @user here. Here in this test, @user is the user who's logged in, and it's actually @other that we're redirecting to. So this @user is the user we're following and unfollowing. This @user here is the current user being logged in. So here we should have the cert redirected to @other. Actually, let's just do it the other way. We'll see that it fails. So if we do this, it should be red. Yeah, because it's actually forwarded to @other. The same thing over here. And there we go. Note that we don't have any redirects for the Hotwire version. That's really the whole point of Hotwire. By using Turbo, we're able to update just the pieces of the page that we want to modify without a redirect. All right, let's rerun the whole test suite, just to make sure it's green, and then we're ready to move on. All right, good to go. Our strategy for approaching the status feed is to start with the proto feed we made in the last lesson, and then make a series of implementations of the working feed with steadily increasing levels of sophistication. Let's take a look at the mockup to remind ourselves of where we're going. Here's the micropost feed. So here, John Calvin is following both Thomas Hobbes and Sasha Smith, and so he sees their microposts in his feed as well as microposts that he made himself. Let's look at a diagram with a basic idea here, what the feed does. So this is a sketch of the micropost table. We've suppressed the content, which isn't important in this context. What is important, though, is the list of user IDs. So in this case, suppose we have user 1 who's following users with IDs 2 and 7, but not any of the other IDs here. Oh, sorry, 8 and 10 as well. So 1, 2, 7, 8, and 10, but not 4, 18, or 9. So what our feed needs to do is pull out the microposts of just these IDs, just the IDs of the user itself and the IDs of the users being followed.
Although it's pretty difficult to implement this feed, it's actually really easy to test. So we're going to write a test first. Because the feed is attached to the user model, it'll go in the user test file. So that's this. You can put it here. And let's remind ourselves of what the data looks like. Actually, let's do this. We want users.yaml. And we also want to look at the microposts. And finally, look at the relationships. So let's pull out some of these users here. I'm going to pull out the first three in variables. This is Michael. Archer. And Lana. And so the feed should certainly include the post from a followed user. So let's look over here in the relationships. Let's start with Michael, who's following Lana. So let's say this is test for posts from a followed user. So each of Lana's microposts, which we can see here, there are two of them, should appear in Michael's feed. Let's say this is post from the following list, from user.following. We're going to assert that Michael's feed, so remember in the user model, we have this feed. It's just the proto feed right now. But we've got this feed, so we're going to say assert michael.feed.include this post, so post following. And we also want the feed to include the user's own micropost, so that's post from self. So michael.micropost.each do post self, and this is the same assertion. Michael.feed include post self. And finally, we want posts from an unfollowed user not to appear in the feed. So in this case, if you look at the relationships, Michael is following Lana and Mallory, but not Archer. Archer is following Michael, but Michael is not following Archer. So if we say archer.micropost, iterate over these microposts. This is post from an unfollowed user. Assert not michael.feed .include post unfollowed. Save that. Let's see, we should be definitely red. Some of these will pass, right? Because right now, these will pass. These assertions will pass. But this test will fail overall because Lana's microposts don't appear. So actually, both of these are passing now. These are here mainly so that if we make any errors in our feed implementation, this will catch those mistakes. So what's failing right now is these microposts, and then these are here just as a safety net. All right, we're ready now to start with the implementation. And I mentioned in the last lesson that we did micropost.where instead of just returning micropost because this will generalize more naturally to the full feed. And we're going to put that into practice right now. Let's take a look at a guess of the kind of SQL you might be looking for. Just going to put this in the Scratch area. So we're going to issue a select. We're going to select all microposts, so we'll select all elements from microposts, where the user ID is in a list of IDs of the users being followed, or, actually it should be caps, just conventionally, or the user ID is equal to the current user's ID. In writing this, we're hoping that SQL supports something like this in keyword for set inclusion, and in fact it does. And remember, we're using the terminology following, so this is really the IDs of the users in the following list. So we expect something like this. I think something like this might work. So we need to make a list of the following IDs. Let me show you some ways to do that. Actually, let's go here to this console. Recall that we can use the map method like this. We can map over a list. I'm going to call 2s on each of these integers. Gives me an array of strings. We also saw there was a shorthand for this in lesson 4, so we can do map &::2s. That just applies 2s to each element. And we can also join these, say on comma space. So it turns out this is exactly the form that we need for these following IDs. So we can do something like this, user.first. Let's just look at one of the users. Pull out all the following. These are all the users being followed. Just pull them out initially. So if we call .map :ID here, that's just all the IDs of those users being followed. And this is exactly the list of IDs that we want for something like this. So we're thinking that maybe we'll have where user ID in followed IDs. So the way to do that is with this escaping we saw before. We want something like this, following IDs. This isn't going to work though, right? Because we need to build up this array. Except that this is so useful, Rails actually supplies it by default. User.first.following IDs. So in fact, all of that work was unnecessary. And this actually does have the following IDs. So if we save this, we'll get one step closer to passing. You can see the problem here is that in the query, we've got user ID in just raw IDs, but they actually need to be inside of parens. So let's do this. Now we've only got one failure, line 97, so it's here. So now it's just the post from self, and that's right. We need this here, this or user ID equals the user's ID. So we can say user ID in following IDs, or user ID equals question mark and then user.id. This won't work actually. I mean, it's pretty obvious it won't work if you think about it. Right, undefined local variable or method user. That's because this is really self. This is also self here. Let me just put it in. Right, over here we had, this is user.following IDs. This is just a user.first. So if we save this though, we're actually green. Right? This is a working feed. get rid of the self dot. So this is just our best attempt at trying to think what kind of SQL query might work. And this actually built a working feed. In fact, in some applications, this implementation might be good enough. But it's not quite good enough for a site that gets any sort of real users. So before fixing that, see if you can figure out why. I'll give you a hint. What if a user is following 5,000 other users? What's going on here is that this is pulling out all of the following IDs, all of these, no matter how many there are. So there might be 5,000 if a user is following 5,000 other users. So the way to fix this is to use what's called an SQL subselect. And we're going to start refactoring this by changing the question mark to be a symbol. You'll see why in a second, why I'm doing this. So this now takes a hash, key value pairs, following IDs, colon, following IDs, and then user ID, ID. Save that. Still green. And now what we can do is replace this following IDs list with what's called a subselect, as I mentioned. So this is like this. We're going to select followed ID from relationships. Where follower ID is equal to colon user ID. So this is just a string now. This is an SQL string. But what this syntax here does is interpolates an escaped version of the value corresponding to this key, in this case user ID. So now we can replace this here. And this is going to make a query that looks like this. Select star from micropost where user ID in this subselect. Or user ID is equal to the given ID. So it'll interpolate these. This will be something like 1. This will be 1. So let's go over here and save it and see what happens. Oh, we've got a failure. Line 93. So now the posts from Lana are not being found. Let's tail the log to see what happened there. We can see here that the actual query being executed has this raw colon user ID. And that's because this here is now just a string. It's not an array. So instead of using this key value pair, we can actually just interpolate it directly into this as a string. Like this. Now it's passing. So now this arranges to put that set inclusion inside the database rather than pulling out all of the IDs. It makes a subselect that contains those IDs, and that's far more efficient. So this is it. This is a working feed. This will scale up pretty nicely even with thousands of users. Of course, if you ever reached a scale where you had hundreds of thousands or millions of users, you'd have to do something fancier than this. But this is quite good and certainly serves our purposes well for now. So let's rerun the whole test suite. And there we go, everything is green. Our tests say this is working. Let's take a look at the app. Refresh it. And there we go. It's the feed of the users being followed. Check it out. So if I unfollow this user, now the feed shouldn't have that user's micropost anymore. There it is. Go to users here, unfollow, unfollow, follow, go back to users, refollow, looks like it's working. So this completes the sample application. It's now done. We've got this great core with the user sign up, log in, log out, account activation, password reset, and now we've added microposts and this social layer where users can follow each other. So let's deploy this thing to production, see if it works. Now we can push up. And deploy. All right, let's check it out. By the way, I mentioned here that there was a reason I put in this user ID rather than the question mark, and that's because it appears in two different places. So it's more convenient to use the key value pair in that circumstance. But in any case, it should be working. Let's take a look at it. Oh, that's right. We need to run the migrations. Let's reset the database. And now we'll run the migration and seed the database with the sample data. All right, let's check it out. And there we go. It's working. All right. Well, this is a major milestone. This is a challenging tutorial, and by getting to the end of this tutorial, you've gotten yourself a really impressive foundation in Ruby on Rails programming and web development generally. We've covered all of the major features of Rails, including models, views, controllers, templates, partials, filters, validations, callbacks, has many belongs to and has many through associations, security, testing, and deployment. There's lots more to learn, of course, and if you'd like a guide to further resources, take a look at the end of Chapter 12 of the Ruby on Rails tutorial book. But this is a great start. Congratulations.